Marlon Brando was alone when the call came. Not alone in the dramatic sense, not abandoned or forgotten, but alone in the way a man is alone when the world finally stops asking anything of him. The phone rang in a quiet room far from cameras, far from applause, far from the illusion that talent could shield him from ordinary pain. He let it ring once, twice, before answering, already aware that whatever waited on the other end would not be kind. The voice spoke carefully, as if choosing softer words might lessen the damage. It did not. His son was gone. No build-up, no explanation, just a fact that landed heavy and immovable. Marlon did not shout. He did not collapse. He simply closed his eyes because opening them felt like agreeing to a reality he wasn't ready to accept. For most of his life, Marlon had believed he could outthink pain. He had survived a broken childhood, an angry home, a father whose approval was always just out of reach, and a mother whose struggles carved quiet absences into his memory. Acting had become his armor. On stage and on screen, he could transform suffering into something useful, something applauded. But this was different. There was no role to play here, no lines to memorize, no audience to impress. This loss did not ask for performance. It demanded surrender. He thought of his son not as the man the world knew, but as the boy who once ran barefoot across grass, laughing without caution. He remembered hands held too briefly, conversations postponed for later, promises made with confidence that time would always wait. Fame had told him he could delay everything. Family had believed him. Now the bill had arrived, and it was unforgiving. Outside, life continued without permission. Cars passed. Birds moved from branch to branch. Somewhere, people were arguing about things that suddenly felt embarrassingly small. Marlon sat still, the phone resting in his hand long after the call ended, realizing that this was the moment no amount of success could soften. He had spent decades portraying powerful men brought to their knees by fate. Only now did he understand how quiet that moment really was. No music, no dramatic collapse, just a man, a room, and the irreversible weight of love that had nowhere left to go. He understood then that grief was not loud or cinematic. It arrived without warning and stayed without apology. It would follow him into every role, every interview, every empty house. It would sit beside him in moments of laughter and wait patiently in moments of silence. This was not the end of his story, but it was the fracture running through all that followed. From that day forward, every performance carried a shadow the audience could feel but never name, a private sorrow stitched permanently into his voice. His pauses, his eyes, and the way he stood alone after that call changed everything he thought understood. The days after the call blurred into each other, measured not by time but by absence. Marlon Brando moved through them like a man underwater, aware of motion but disconnected from sound. People came and went quietly, unsure how to speak to someone whose grief felt larger than words. Some offered sympathy, others offered silence. Neither reached him. Loss had rewired the world. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar. He woke up expecting nothing and still felt disappointed when the day arrived. He avoided mirrors, not out of vanity, but because his face no longer belonged to him. It carried a weight he hadn't agreed to wear. Lines seemed deeper. His eyes looked older, as if they had seen something they could never unsee. He thought about all the times he had chosen work over home, ambition over stillness. At the time, it felt necessary. Now it felt permanent. Regret didn't scream. It whispered, repeating itself in moments he couldn't escape. Marlon tried to return to routine, believing structure might save him. Scripts sat unopened. Roles that once excited him now felt hollow. He could still act, still perform, still disappear into other lives, but something fundamental had shifted. Every character felt borrowed. Every emotion felt secondary to the one he carried with him. Grief didn't stop him from working. It made the work heavier, as if each scene required him to lift the same unbearable truth again and again. At night, memories arrived uninvited, small moments, a laugh, a look, a sentence spoken years earlier that now echoed with unintended finality. He realized then that grief wasn't about death alone. It was about unfinished conversations, about versions of the future that would never exist, about the quiet understanding that love doesn't end when someone someone is gone, it becomes harder to carry. Marlon didn't talk about it publicly. He never learned how. Pain, when exposed, felt like something people wanted to consume, not understand. So he kept it private, folding it inward, letting it shape him without explanation. Those close to him noticed the change. He grew quieter, more distant, not colder, but more careful, as if he had learned that loving deeply came with a cost he could no longer afford to ignore. And yet, beneath the weight, something else formed, a sharper honesty, a deeper presence. When Marlon listened now, he truly listened. When he spoke, his words carried restraint, as though he knew how fragile moments really were. Grief hadn't destroyed him. It had stripped him down to something raw, more human. And whether the world realized it or not, every performance from that point forward carried the imprint of a father who had lost what mattered most, and kept going anyway. Time did not heal Marlon Brando the way people promised it would. It only taught him how to live alongside the wound. Months passed, then years, and the world slowly decided it was appropriate to move on. Invitations returned. Cameras waited. Journalists asked about projects instead of pain. To them, the crisis had ended. To Marlon, it had simply settled in. Grief became quieter, but heavier, like something carried in a pocket every day without ever being set down. He began to disappear more often, not dramatically, not with announcements. He would simply retreat to islands, to empty houses, to places where no one expected him to be brilliant or charming or legendary. Solitude felt safer than sympathy. In isolation, he didn't have to perform strength. He could let the weight exist without explanation. People mistook this withdrawal for arrogance or indifference or decline. They didn't see that it was survival. When Marlon returned to acting, something had changed in him that directors couldn't quite name. His silences were longer. His eyes carried a stillness that unsettled people. He no longer reached for emotion. It arrived on its own, uninvited and undeniable. Scenes that once would have been acted were now lived. Pain had stripped away excess. What remained was truth, raw and unfiltered. Audiences felt it immediately, even if they didn't understand why. He rarely spoke of his son, but everything he did afterward was shaped by that loss. He became fiercely protective of what little intimacy he allowed. He stopped chasing approval. Fame, once intoxicating, now felt fragile and loud. He understood how quickly everything could be taken, how thin the line was between presence and absence. That knowledge changed the way he loved, the way he trusted, the way he existed in rooms full of people. There were moments, quiet ones, when he allowed himself to remember without pain, a smile instead of an ache, a memory that warmed instead of cut. Those moments never lasted long, but they reminded him why continuing mattered. Grief had not erased love. It had preserved it in a different form, one that demanded endurance rather than expression. Marlon Brando was no longer chasing greatness. He had already seen what the world could give and what it could take away. What mattered now was honesty, on screen, off screen, within himself. And though the loss never left him, it became the silent force behind his depth, his restraint, and the gravity people sensed but could never fully explain. He carried it forward, not as a burden to display, but as a truth he would live with for the rest of his life. In the years that followed, Marlon Brando became something people struggled to categorize. He was still called a legend, still praised as the greatest actor of his generation, but the titles no longer mattered to him. What mattered were the quiet moments no one filmed, the long pauses before he spoke, the way he listened more than he talked, the way he carried loss without turning it into spectacle. Grief had taught him what fame never could, that nothing you build in public can protect what you love in private. Those who knew him late in life said he had softened, not hardened, that beneath the distance was a man who understood pain too well to dismiss it in others. He became gentler with children, more patient with strangers, less interested in winning arguments that once might have mattered. Loss had removed his need to dominate a room. Presence was enough. Silence was enough. Survival was enough. When people asked him about legacy, he changed the subject. He knew that history would argue about his work long after he was gone. What it would never fully understand was the cost. Every pause on screen, every restrained outburst, every quiet authority people admired was shaped by something taken from him that could never be replaced. His performances weren't just powerful because of talent. They were heavy because they carried lived truth. Marlon Brando didn't overcome grief. He integrated it. He let it inform who he became instead of letting it destroy him. That was his quiet victory. Not fame, Not awards, endurance. He lived knowing that love leaves marks, and those marks are proof that something real existed. And maybe that is why his presence still lingers, why his eyes still hold weight decades later. Because behind every role was a man who had stood still after a phone call and chosen to keep going anyway. If this story moved you, stay with us. Subscribe for more untold moments from the lives of legends, stories about the human cost behind fame, greatness, and survival. And if you believe these stories matter, share this one. Someone out there may need to hear that even the strongest figures carry wounds, and that continuing forward is sometimes the bravest act of all.